Welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be joined by David Frum for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series, From Dialogues. David, as viewers and listeners know, is a staff writer at The Atlantic, the author of several books, and a highly coveted guest and commentator on various cable television programs. We're honored to provide him with a platform to share his insights and analysis on key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's episode, we're discussing a recent wave of high-profile violent incidents in the city of Toronto, including on the city's subway system, and what may be behind it, and what policymakers ought to be doing to restore a sense of security and safety in the country's largest and most dynamic city. If time permits, we may also cover David's new must-read article for The Atlantic about how the Republican Party has come to be marked by, for the lack of a better term, being jerks, and its lessons for Canadian conservatives. David, thanks as always for joining me.
Great to be back.
We're speaking on February 2nd. Just a day or so ago, a well-regarded CBC editor died after a random assault while walking on a busy street in Toronto. His killer remains at large, and it follows a series of high-profile cases of random assaults and murders, including on the City of Toronto subway system. You grew up in the city and have plenty of friends and family there. Let's start by just having you reflect on this recent surge of violent crime and how it's affecting Toronto's residents and those who care about the city.
Well, I grew up in Toronto in the 60s and 70s, and it was a much smaller city in those days. For me, I remember very vividly when the Toronto subway was extended from its previous northern hub of Davisville Avenue to Eglinton Avenue. That made a big difference to me because it meant I could take the Bayview bus to Eglinton and get on the subway on my own without help from any adult. So that was a smaller town. And of course, Toronto was very safe then, and we had access to American news, and we would contrast Toronto to the other great cities on the Great Lakes, to the Detroits, to the Buffaloes, the Clevelands, and see how much safer Toronto was. Now let's start with the good news. Toronto now is a great world city, a great metropolis, one of the most diverse cities in the world. I believe a majority of Torontonians are foreign-born, and it remains, from the point of view of the very worst crimes, still an incredibly safe city. For all the bad news, I just looked it up. Toronto had 67 homicides in 2022, which is less than it had in 2014, 2015, and we're back to the levels of the early 2000s. It's not, where in an ideal world, it would be lower than that. In the very safe days of the 1990s, Toronto would have about 50 homicides a year. But 67 is lower than 2014. We are not having a surge of the worst, or we're not having a spasm of the very worst kind of crime. The other piece of good news is that because of the presence of all kinds of camera systems, both those that are intended to catch people, like the assailant of Michael Finley, the CBC documentarian, and those that people have on their doors, that Toronto is now achieving a clearance rate of 80%. That is, the police are going, if you commit a murder, the police will almost certainly catch you sooner or later. And you'll be punished as you deserve. One more piece of good news, which is Canadian policy against guns remains very effective. So of these 67 homicides, fewer than half were gun crimes. And so one of the reasons that you have a perception of violence is Canadians who want to be violent don't have access to guns. And so they use other things that are terrible weapons and do a lot of harm, probably turn out not to be lethal. That modern hospitals can save you from a very serious knife assault, and they may not be able to save you from a gun assault. But here's what is worrying and what Canadians thinking about Toronto need to take on mind. When people are making a decision whether to go out for the evening, whether to take their kids to the park, whether they just feel good in their environment, they're not really thinking about homicide. They're thinking about lower level. They're thinking about lower level forms of disorder and threat and discomfort. Are you going to be threatened? Are you going to be intimidated? Is somebody going to pull a knife even if they don't use it? Are you going to be spat on by somebody who's high on drugs of some kind? That's the thing that is really getting worse in Toronto. And that's partly because of a larger phenomenon that is North America wide, which is we seem to have much more dangerous drugs available than were available 10 years ago, and drugs that create much more aggressive behavior than, I mean, methamphetamines, a person who is taking methamphetamine, it behaves more aggressively to the rest of the world than a person who's taking even as terrible a drug as heroin. Those drugs that were the dominant drugs of 10 years ago made people more passive. The dominant drugs of today seem to be making people more aggressive, more violent. And that's what's going on. There's another problem that is going on, which is cities are having trouble coping with homelessness. And Toronto participated in an intellectual movement, and that was very exciting 20 years ago, called the housing first approach. When I was in the Bush administration, we explored this. I remember the guy who was one of the intellectual leaders of it got a job in the Bush administration, and a big bunch of money was put in his hands to try to experiment. And the idea was, and this is, I think, something that a lot of so-called homeless advocates will believe, what characterizes the homeless? They don't have homes. If you can get them, a little apartment, we're not talking about the Beverly Hillbillies here, but if you can get them a place with a roof, with a door, with a lock, with a toilet and sink, you get them off the streets. And so this was called the housing first approach, and it's been tried in a very big way over the past 20 years. In some cases, San Francisco made an especially big commitment to it. San Francisco built enough units over the past 20 years to house every one of the people who are homeless in San Francisco in the year 2011, which is when they really got into this thing. They built enough to every homeless person on the streets in San Francisco. They built a room over the next 10 years, and the problem got worse. Toronto's followed this approach, and there's still on any given night 10,000 people sleeping on the streets of Toronto, or so it's estimated. So what went wrong was what the housing first approach did was it provided very cheap housing to people who are on the cusp who are economically marginal, but it did not deal with the people who are on the streets, because they're not economically marginal. They're there because of mental health issues. They're there because of addiction issues. And as those things have gotten worse over the past decade, even providing these units hasn't made much of a difference. Toronto's begun to say things like it's going to enforce the bylaw against camping in parks. I think that's a good thing. But you need to begin by conceptualizing you do not have a homelessness problem. And we have to stop using that word. We have a mental health and addiction problem. And some of the men, not all, but some, are violent. Others are victims of violence, like in this terrible story of the man who's Kenny Lee, I believe was his name, who was sleeping on the streets, who was attacked by teenage girls and horribly assaulted and the details are very upsetting. He's a victim. Other people like that are perpetrators, but he had the same mental health issues that other people who are more violent had. We have to conceptualize that. That's the policy issue: mental health, substance abuse, not lack of housing.
Yeah, let me just ask you to elaborate on those tremendous insights. As you say, David, there's obviously complex, multifaceted factors at play here. You mentioned mental health, homelessness, drug addiction, etc. But is there a role for public policy too? Is there a risk that we've permitted good intentions about seeing these issues through the lens of, say, social policy to cause us to neglect basic responsibilities for law enforcement and public safety?
Yeah, no, I hope I endorse that. So there are 10,000 people sleeping on the streets. And as I say, they are mixed populations. Some of them are potentially violent. Some of them are potentially victims of violence. And you want to have compassion for them, and you want to have some safety. But there are millions of people who need to be able to use the parks, and the parks cannot be turned into public toilets. So, the commitment A has to be to public order for the vast majority of people who are leading normal lives, who need a subway where they feel secure. And there is a bad tendency, I think, for people to say, well, if you're not an actual victim of violence in a way that really puts your life at risk, then you should stop complaining. So if what happened is somebody who just seemed kind of off his head, threatened you or snarled at you or spat at you, you have no complaints. Well, people should be able to go live their lives in public with a degree of security. And especially as one of the things that marks Toronto, has made Toronto such a great city, is this downtown intensification. So that means people are living in less space than they would do in a more sprawling city, a Houston, a Dallas, a Las Vegas. That means the public domain is ever more important. Maybe it doesn't matter if the parks in Las Vegas are made unusable, but it matters in a condo town like Toronto if they are. So those spaces belong to everybody and have to be protected for everybody, and not literally, and they have to be protected above all for the majority who want to use them in the way that they were intended to be built. So start with an idea that people are entitled to an expectation of public order, and then deal as best you can with the problem of the hardcore, and accept you may not be able to deal with it perfectly, but at least you can protect the great majority from the worst.
As you alluded, David, Canada isn't unique in dealing with the surge of violent crime. I'm speaking to you from New York City that's had similar issues over the past several months, including on its own subway system. Do you see any similarities? And are there lessons for Toronto from the ebb and flow of crime rates in New York City over the past several decades?
Well, New York City remains also a very safe city from the point of view of the headline violent crimes. But New York, and especially Manhattan, is experiencing a deterioration of the kind of public order that it had 10 years ago. And that's partly because of external factors. The drugs are worse. And the victims of drugs are more likely to act out and more likely to be violent and more likely to be on the street. But it's also that there have been policing decisions made. And I think what basically happened, and again, this is not completely crazy. So we probably reached the high watermark of public safety in North America about the year 2010, 2012. And New York, certainly that was probably the safest time probably ever in the history of the city of New York, certainly since it became a big city. And the burden of law enforcement doesn't fall equally on everybody. And the people on whom it falls more unequally raise their voices. And I think there was a reasonable feeling, thinking, things are pretty safe. We can experiment a little bit. Let's de-incarcerate a little, see what happens. Let's take a more permissive approach to people sleeping on park benches than we used to do. And let's see what happens. And so some of that tight enforcement that was there from the early 90s to the early 2010s slackened. And that was an experiment, and I understand why it made. I mean, I wrote at the time articles for The Atlantic saying this experiment is going to end badly, but that was just one man's opinion. I could well have been wrong, and maybe I was also wrong in my own way. But it did end badly, and I think everyone now needs to realize, what, the policies of the 1990s to the 2010s were within an imperfect set of imperfect alternatives that have costs. This was for most people, this was the best setting of the dials you could get.
Talking about New York City, in an episode of Hub Dialogues last year, Reihan Salam, the president of the Manhattan Institute and someone you know well, said the following, quote, "My view is that violent crime actually engenders a deep suspicion of your neighbors, of people who belong to different groups. You start to think in terms of group categories and group averages in a way that can be very corrosive to the idea of building a successful, vibrant, multi-ethnic society. That's one reason why I'm so zealous about public safety and what violent crime does. In fact, there's so much evidence that actually it would be really pretty darn cost effective to spend a lot more on public safety," unquote. I've been thinking about this a lot in recent days, David. One of Toronto's great advantages, of course, that it's among the world's most diverse and pluralistic cities. How much should we think of public safety as an investment in protecting that advantage?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. I'll give you a pithier and maybe more brutal way of putting it than Reihan in his elegant speech did. So, between 1960 and 1970, the United States saw an explosion of crime, and just at the same time as there was a slackening of, if I remember, I've used this number in my book on the 1970s, so I hope I have it right. But despite the manifold increase in crime, there were actually fewer people in prison in the United States in the year 1969 than there had been in the year 1959. And when people want to understand what killed the FDR, LBJ, New Deal coalition, that was it. It was the crime whip. And John Mitchell, who's Richard Nixon's attorney general, famously said in an unrecorded interview, in an off-the-record interview, so this country, he said in about 1969-70, is going so far right, you will not recognize it. And if you were someone who's on the more liberal side, you should have heeded that. That was true. That a society that had this lowercase p progressive approach to all kinds of social problems by 1980 had thrown them all out the window because people didn't feel safe. A society that felt very safe in 2010 was able to take all kinds of social risks, and some of them didn't play out, and some of them did. So if you want to have a society based on easygoingness, trust, not looking nervously at different looking people in the subway, make everybody feel safe.
One of the things that's striking in recent years is actually the exodus out of the city of Toronto. In 2019, the year prior to the pandemic, about 60,000 people left the city, a quarter of them under the age of 5. We've spoken previously about how the durability of remote work might change where people live and work. Yeah. Is there a risk for Toronto and other major centers that growing concerns about crime will only exacerbate those trends?
Yeah, I think crime is probably a lesser driver of that than other things, which is, and this is sort of something that Toronto chose, and it's not a bad thing, which is young people live in the city. Then they have families, they want more space, they want more walkability, and so they then move. They used to move to the suburbs, now they move to smaller centers. Then the kids get older and they sell the house and they say, we're going to have some fun and we want to go to a place where there's restaurants and movies, and they move back. And I mean, those who's living in those condo towers? It's older people, and that's maybe part of the life cycle of how a city works. And maybe it's not so terrible, so long as you've got housing stock and school stock that allows people to have families in the first place. What may be happening in Toronto that is worrying is it may be that younger people are choosing not to have children at all, or only to have one, because they can't buy enough space. So the solution to that may be more building, but it always includes more public safety, because if you live in a building, you need the park. And in a city like Toronto with its weather, in those precious warm months, you're going to be in the park all the time in the good weather, because you have to batten down the hatches during the bad weather. And that park had better be a place where people, parents, especially mothers, feel comfortable bringing very young children. They just feel nothing that they don't want to happen to them is going to happen to them. And public policy should validate that and say, yeah, I mean, we've got 40 families here. We've got one person wandering around muttering and looking intimidating. He's not breaking the law exactly, but he's destroying the park.
Let me ask one final question on this subject before we move on to your excellent essay this week in The Atlantic. That is on the subject of drugs, which you mentioned earlier. In recent months, the province of British Columbia has actually enacted a pretty extraordinary policy of drug decriminalization in an attempt to deal with the problems that province faces with respect to opioids and so on. Just to have you reflect your views on how we ought to think about the balance between recovery, treatment, and enforcement when it comes to dealing with drugs in our major cities in Canada and of course, in the United States.
Yeah. Well, I remain one of the last anti-legalizers. I used to write about this issue a lot. I don't so much anymore because it just became apparent to me. Society's making a big experiment. And you're not going to get very far. When sometimes society tries to do something, you say, you know what, let's see. And let's give it, it looks like we're going to give it a try, and we're going to learn the hard way. I think when we think about how drug regulation works, that the part of drug control that really does seem foredoomed is the attempt to control the supply. The war on drugs approach of destroying sources of drugs, all that does is throw your neighboring countries into chaos, and raise the price. But it doesn't. Maybe it raises the price. It doesn't really stop the flow, because the ability of the planet to produce drugs is almost infinite. The ability of criminal networks to transport them is almost infinite. The constraint on supply is not going to be very successful. But you can constrain demand. If cocaine is legal, lots of more people are going to think this is an acceptable thing for us to try than if it's not legal. That when it's not legal, you're making a conscious decision to enter the underworld when you take cocaine. And if it's legal, then just as It's like any other expensive form of self-harm. People smoke a cigar from time to time. That's self-harming too, but they don't see the harm in it. I think the approach to it has been that's why we're getting a lot more drug use. What we're also discovering is the ingenuity of the criminal pharmaceutical world, the ingenuity of the criminal agricultural world, is they make these drugs more and more potent, and so people are smoking stronger marijuana than they used to. They're getting very, very powerful drugs, and it seems to me that the goal should be discouragement of taking it. The law is part of the process. One of the things that happens when drugs are illegal is it allows you, when someone is before a magistrate because they're in a car accident while under the influence, that if the drug is illegal, the magistrate has more power to say, look, I'm going to give you a reduced sentence if you agree to go to a treatment program. And if you don't, then we throw the maximum sentence at you. If the drug's legal, the magistrate doesn't have that lever, and so you can't get the person into the treatment program. So I don't think we want to make criminals of people, but I think we want to send a clear message that society disapproves. These things are self-harming, and we're going to try to suppress demand for it within our society, because suppressing the supply is going to be almost hopeless.
As we wrap up, let's shift the subject to your article for The Atlantic, in which you describe the trend towards, quote, performative obnoxiousness in Republican Party politics. You argue, for instance, that Republican politicians like Ron DeSantis have come to the view that being something of a jerk is important to base voters. Do you think they're right, or is it possible that they're misreading things? Maybe put differently, is there any market left for a positive aspirational conservatism?
I devoutly believe there's a huge potential market for aspirational conservatism, and it's waiting to be rediscovered. It's going to take different kinds of issues from the issues that characterized the aspirational conservatism of the 80s and 90s. But yes, I think that what do people want? They want to have something of their own. They want to have a home. They want to have a stable family. They don't want to be given it. They want to have the opportunity to go get it for themselves, because that's what makes life worth living. So a conservatism that can identify itself with the aspiration of people to make the best of your own one and only life, that's a powerful message. And you're not a victim. You are empowered. You can do things for yourself. We believe in you. That's when Americans and Canadians turn to pop psychology. That's the message they, that's the message they want from their pop psychologists. I assume it's the message they want from their politicians. The problem is that a lot of the policy content became obsolete, and so it stopped working. And so then that conservatives tended to jettison the aspirational wrapping. In the United States, in particular, conservatives have discovered the power of connecting to feelings of loss and regret and nostalgia. But you can't bring back vanished worlds. So and the promises aren't anyway not so specific. So you end up having these stupid fights over things like plastic versus paper straws. There's a spectacular example of this just before you and I spoke yesterday. Ron DeSantis in Florida announced that he was ending the sales tax on gas stoves in the state of Florida, because gas stoves have become a big cultural marker in the past week in the United States, and conservatives are saying, they have this because there was a paper on the health hazards of gas stoves, and somebody at the Consumer Product Safety Commission said maybe they should be regulated more strictly. And okay, the liberals want to destroy everything. So DeSantis made this press conference. Now, Florida ties with Maine for having the fewest gas stoves of any state in the United States. Only 8% of Florida homes have cook with gas. Makes sense. The ground's really marshy, so you can't bury a pipeline, and there are a lot of hurricanes. So you don't want to have a situation where if the appliance comes out of the wall, it spews this inflammable substance everywhere. So Florida doesn't have gas stoves. The only place that is an exception is up and down the most expensive condos with oceanfront views in Miami. Those places, I looked it up, those places do tend to offer gas as a super luxury item. So what he's doing is, as this performative populism, he's taking, a couple $100 of sales tax off the price of an $8 million oceanfront condo. And how is that any kind of but you're so into your own craziness. But the more serious example was, and here's this place where I think it really made a difference, is in the Senate race in Pennsylvania, which featured Mehmet Oz against John Fetterman. So Oz was a basically pretty moderate candidate. He got tripped up on abortion because he was trying to play it both ways, but he was obviously not someone who was an anti-abortion warrior. The first Muslim to get a major party nomination for a U.S. Senate seat. And although he had a rather disgraceful career as a TV pitchman in the middle of his career, in his early years, he was once upon a time a really important, great doctor. And so it was not crazy that this guy would go on to the Senate. His opponent had a stroke. And there was a moment where this guy who had had this kind of shameful career as a TV pitchman could have said something compassionate, could have said, I wish my opponent well. I have dealt with stroke patients, and, I think the prognosis for his recovery is excellent. I look forward when he's ready to meeting his formidable intellect on a debate stage anytime he wants. But of course, he needs to take his own time. But if elected, of course, he can do the job. He shouldn't be elected because he's wrong on taxes and wrong on spending and wrong on this and that. Instead, Oz acted like a total jerk in a state, Pennsylvania, with a lot of people with health problems. He lost by 4 points. I don't know that a nice Oz would not have won that race.
David, I'm in my early 40s. Do you remember the kind of adolescent novels, choose your own adventure novels, where you would read through the book, and at a certain point you'd be asked to choose to go to one page to continue the plot line a certain way, or another page to continue the plot line another way. And of course, what you would do is you'd go back and read the alternative plot when you were finished. I wish we had that ability to carry out our politics. The case that I have in mind is J.D. Vance's Senate run in the state of Ohio, where he had two paths, it seems to me. The path of hillbilly elegy, which reflects some of the message and themes that you were talking about. Personal responsibility, rejecting the idea that we're victims, and so on. And of course, the path that he ultimately took to secure the endorsement of former President Trump and to kind of turn himself into something of a Trumpian candidate. I would have loved to be able to run those two campaigns in parallel, because I have this sneaking suspicion that the hillbilly elegy version would have been equally successful and actually would have positioned Vance to be more than he'll ultimately become in the Senate. I say that against a backdrop which just in the past day or so, he's already endorsed Donald Trump's 2024 presidential run.
Yeah. Right. We can do with I go through a lot of these cases. I mean, one of the things that one of the big Republican super PACs got a lot of money to run billboards in swing states with messages that were just childishly trolling. Climate justice for pregnant men. And the idea was, that's what the Democrats think. Don't you hate that? And of course, it was a total failure because first, people didn't get it because you had to be super highly online even to know what they were talking about. And second, it doesn't answer the question, like, if I'm the swing voter is it's just not that connected to politics, and they want to know what do they may vote on cultural appeals, but they're going to be pretty basic cultural appeals. The swing voter is someone who doesn't like politics, is disconnected from it. And one of the ways I always try to understand the swing voter is, so we're talking on the 2nd of February. I just learned that on February the 12th is the Super Bowl. And I just looked up the teams that are in it. And now I know the names of the teams that are in it, but I can't name any of the players. And I have no opinion about which team should be in. I think, okay, I need to remember the way I think about the Super Bowl, which is I learn about 10 days out when it's going to be and who's in it, is the way most people, or at least the people you most need to talk to, think about elections. So I think what would get me, to care about the Super Bowl, it wouldn't be like trolling comments about one team or the other. I wouldn't understand what they were talking about. But if they say, cheer for team A and you get free wings, then I think about it.
Let me end with a question about the application of your thesis to the state of Canadian conservative politics. Canadian conservatives, at least at the federal level, are in opposition, which can inherently lead to a degree of negativity and oppositionalism. What would be your advice to resist those temptations?
Yeah, it was the same advice we've given when we've talked about this before. The job of an opposition party in a Westminster system is to be ready. And it is to understand that the government has taken the day the government is elected is the first step on its path to ultimate defeat. But the route of defeat, you do not know. You don't have much control over it, but even if you could control it, you can't predict it. So the job of the opposition party is to be ready. And that means building a party structure. It means recruiting candidates, getting money. And it means always focusing on being the acceptable government in waiting to be elected by an issue to be decided later that you have no idea of. An example of this Canadian politics is, I think the present federal Conservatives thought they would be elected by inflation. And probably by the time Canadians vote, inflation is going to have subsided very dramatically. You didn't want to overinvest in the inflation narrative. It might not be the issue on people's minds. But what you can do is at every stage, in no system do you want 100% of the vote. Only fascists aspire to 100% of the vote. You want either in a two-party system, you want your 51%, you want the majority. In a multi-party system, you want your plurality, but you're always seeking to expand your coalition. You know who your core voters are, and you need to keep them happy, but you can't let them run the show because you need the additional voters. And so that means, one of the Canadian politicians who had the most to learn, the most to teach the world is Jason Kenney, especially when he was in federal politics, where he just said, I am going to every wedding, every bar mitzvah, every christening, everything. And I am showing people I care. I'm showing people I understand them. I'm showing them they are important to me. I'm showing them they are welcome in our party. We want them. And he just had this deep message of acceptance. Yeah. He never got 100% of the vote. But two things happened. One is he got more of the vote than he otherwise would. And he also made sure that some of the people who voted against him weren't super motivated. They had no anger about it. They were not rallying their friends and family and make sure we all have to drive together to the polls to stop this nightmarish future. Don't agree with him about the taxes and the spending, but I can live with them. He certainly seems to like me. That's the beginning. Just show one last comment on this. And I've always thought this is a true wisdom. So in the American election of 1936, the Republicans nominate, forgive me, I may have told this story on this hub before, but I'm going to tell it again if I have. The Republicans nominate Alf Landon, governor of Kansas. And FDR's campaign manager, the Postmaster General, James Farley, in some speech refers to him as the governor of a typical Midwestern state. Not so harsh. But FDR sends him an excoriating letter in which he said, whenever you speak about any group of people, you must use a positive adjective. If you had said, governor of one of our splendid prairie states, there would have been no problem. But coming from a New Yorker, especially anything that seems derisive, and I think that's good advice for everybody, and I would say for liberals and Democrats, whenever you're talking about any group that you don't like, white males. One of our splendid white males. That's what FDR would do. Just remember, compliments, because a large part of politics is, we talked about gas stoves before, turning down the pressure on the people who are against you, making them feel like, you know what, I can, don't love it, I can live with it. And that gives you a better position to govern from, because you have more, you encounter less ferocious opposition. It gives you a chance at winning their vote the next time if you do a good job. And it's just generally leads to less heat in society.
Well, that's a good place to end this conversation. Tremendous insights as always. David Frum, I want to thank you for joining me for another episode of Frum Dialogues, and I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
Me too. Bye-bye.